The gunshot echoed across the Montana prairie like thunder, fading into the twilight as Abigail Davis clutched her baby tighter to her chest and ran. The year was 1885, and she had just witnessed her husband's murder at the hands of land grabbers who wanted their small homestead. 3 days of desperate flight had brought her to this abandoned cabin nestled against the foothills. Her milk nearly dried up from stress, her infant son crying ceaselessly from hunger and discomfort. The cabin offered little comfort, just 4 weathered walls, a leaky roof, and a crudely fashioned cradle left behind by previous occupants. Abigail placed her wailing son, Samuel, in the cradle, her own tears falling freely as she rocked it with trembling hands. "Hush now, my sweet boy," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Your mama's here, I know you're hungry, I know." But Samuel only cried harder, his tiny face red with exertion, his needs beyond what she could provide. Abigail felt her heart shattering. 22 years old and already a widow, alone in the wilderness with a 2-month-old child and nothing but the clothes on her back and her husband's pocket watch. She didn't hear the approaching hoofbeats over her son's cries. It wasn't until a shadow darkened the doorway that she looked up, terror seizing her heart. A tall man filled the doorframe, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the dying light. Instinctively, Abigail positioned herself between the stranger and her child. "Madam," the man said, removing his hat, "I mean no harm." His voice was deep but gentle, carrying the drawl of Texas. Heard the little one crying from half a mile away. The last rays of sunlight illuminated his features, sun-bronzed skin, dark blonde hair, and eyes the color of a summer sky. He wore the dust and leather of a working cowboy, a gun holstered at his side, but nothing about his stance suggested threat. "Please leave us be," Abigail said, trying to keep her voice steady despite her fear. "We have nothing of value." The man's gaze took in the sparse cabin, her disheveled appearance, and the crying baby. Understanding dawned in his eyes. "Name's Bennett Irwin, madam. I work the Circle K ranch just beyond those hills." He gestured vaguely westward. "Been tracking a stray heifer when I heard the crying. Thought someone might need help." A particularly piercing wail from Samuel made Abigail turn back to the cradle, her shoulders slumped in defeat. "He's hungry," she admitted, "and I haven't been able to." The words caught in her throat. Without waiting for an invitation, Bennett stepped into the cabin and approached the cradle. Abigail tensed, but instead of reaching for the baby, he simply looked down at the red-faced infant. "We'll rock him together," he said softly, placing one large, calloused hand on the edge of the cradle. "Sometimes that's all a little one needs to feel safe." His kindness broke something in Abigail. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks as she nodded, allowing him to gently rock the cradle alongside her. "I'm Abigail Davis," she whispered. "And this is Samuel," Bennett nodded. "Mrs. Davis, you and your boy need food and proper shelter. The ranch isn't far. The owner's wife is a kind woman. She'd welcome you both." Abigail hesitated. She'd learned the hard way that kindness often came with a price, but Samuel's cries were growing weaker and she knew she had no choice. "Just until morning," she agreed reluctantly. Bennett helped her gather her meager belongings and fashioned a sling from his bandana to secure Samuel against Abigail's chest. With surprising gentleness for a man of his size, he helped her onto his horse before mounting behind her. "Hold tight to your little one," he instructed, reaching around her to take the reins. The warmth of his chest against her back was the first comfort Abigail had felt in days. The Circle K ranch was larger than Abigail had imagined, with a sprawling main house and several outbuildings. As Bennett helped her dismount in the yard, a plump woman with silver-streaked hair emerged from the house. "Bennett Irwin, what have you brought home this time?" she called, but her tone held no malice. "Mrs. King, this is Mrs. Davis and her son Samuel. They need shelter for the night, and the little one needs feeding." Mrs. King's expression softened as she took in Abigail's appearance and the now whimpering baby. "Of course they'll stay. Bring them in immediately." The next hours passed in a blur for Abigail. Mrs. King, the ranch owner's wife, was a force of nature. She immediately sent for the wet nurse who had recently weaned the foreman's youngest child. While they waited, she settled Abigail in a chair by the kitchen fire and pressed a cup of sweet tea into her hands. "What happened to you, child, Mrs. King asked gently. The kindness broke Abigail's resolve. Between sobs, she told the story of how land speculators had killed her husband, Thomas, when he refused to sell their small homestead. How she'd fled with nothing but Samuel and the clothes on their backs. Bennett stood in the doorway, his expression darkening as he listened. When she finished, he exchanged a look with Mrs. King. "The Blackwater Company," he said grimly. "They've been buying up land all through the territory one way or another." Mrs. King nodded. "They won't find you here, dear. The Kings don't bow to bullies." When the wet nurse arrived, Abigail nearly wept with relief as the woman expertly took Samuel and began to feed him. For the first time in days, his cries turned to contented gurgles. "You need rest, Mrs. King declared, leading Abigail to a small but comfortable bedroom. "Tomorrow we'll sort everything out." Exhaustion claimed Abigail almost immediately, and she slept deeply for the first time since Thomas's death. Morning brought clarity and with it, fresh anxiety. Abigail knew she couldn't impose on the King's generosity for long. After a hearty breakfast, during which Samuel was passed around and cooed over by several ranch hands, Mr. King himself proposed a solution. "We've a small cabin near the north pasture," the gray-haired rancher said. "Been empty since our last hand moved on. You're welcome to it, Mrs. Davis, if you're willing to help Mrs. King with household duties in exchange." Abigail looked up in surprise. "I couldn't possibly—" "Nonsense," Mrs. King interrupted. "I've needed help for ages, and that baby needs a safe place to grow. It's settled." Bennett, who had been watching silently from his place at the table, nodded in approval. "I'll ride out with you later to get it ready." And so began Abigail's new life at the Circle K. The cabin, though simple, was clean and sound, with a small garden plot beside it. Mrs. King supplied her with essentials, linens, cookware, and even a few dresses that had belonged to her daughter who had married and moved east. Bennett proved to be a frequent visitor. At first he came with practical excuses, delivering firewood, fixing a loose shutter, bringing milk from the ranch's dairy cow. But soon his visits needed no justification. He would simply appear at her door in the evenings, hat in hand, asking if he might see how the little man was doing. Samuel, for his part, took to Bennett immediately. The infant would calm at the sound of the cowboy's deep voice, staring up with wide eyes whenever Bennett spoke or sang the low, rumbling lullabies he claimed to have learned from his own father. One evening, about 3 weeks after Abigail's arrival, Bennett found her sitting on the cabin's small porch, Samuel asleep in her arms, tears streaming silently down her face. "Abigail," he asked softly, the first time he'd used her given name, "what's troubling you?" She wiped her cheeks hurriedly. "It's nothing, just today would have been Thomas's birthday." Bennett sat beside her on the step, careful not to wake Samuel. "Tell me about him," he said simply, and so she did. She told him about Thomas's dreams for their homestead, his gentle nature, how excited he'd been when Samuel was born. Bennett listened without interruption, his presence solid and comforting beside her. "He sounds like a good man," Bennett said when she finally fell silent. "Samuel will be proud to hear about his pa when he's older." Abigail looked at him curiously. "Most men would tell me not to dwell on the past," Bennett shrugged. "Most men are fools. Grief needs its time, same as joy." In that moment, something shifted between them, an understanding, a deepening of the friendship that had been growing. When Bennett left that night, he squeezed her hand briefly, the touch conveying what words could not. Spring bloomed across the Montana landscape, bringing new life to the ranch. Samuel grew stronger daily, now able to hold his head up and gifting Abigail with gummy smiles that melted her heart. Her work for Mrs. King, cooking, cleaning, and mending, gave her purpose beyond motherhood, and the ranch community had embraced her as one of their own. But shadows from the past weren't easily dispelled. Word reached the Circle K that men from the Blackwater Company had been asking about a young widow with a baby in nearby settlements. Mr. King increased patrols around the ranch boundaries, and Bennett took to carrying his rifle when working the range. Anxiety gnawed at Abigail. She couldn't bear the thought of bringing danger to the people who had shown her such kindness. Late one night, she began packing her few possessions, determined to move on before dawn. A knock at the door startled her. Bennett stood outside, concern etched on his features. "You're leaving," he said, taking in the half-packed bag on her bed. It wasn't a question. "I have to," Abigail replied, unable to meet his eyes. "These men won't stop looking for me. I can't risk bringing trouble to you all." Bennett closed the door behind him and crossed to where she stood. "And where will you go? How will you keep Samuel safe alone?" "I don't know," she admitted. "But I've survived before." "Barely," he reminded her. "Abigail, running isn't the answer." "Then what is?" she demanded, her voice rising. Samuel stirred in his cradle but didn't wake. Bennett ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in the gesture. "We fight for what's rightfully yours. Your husband died defending your land. Don't let that be in vain." Abigail sank onto the edge of the bed. "How? I'm one woman against a company of ruthless men." "You're not alone," Bennett said firmly, kneeling before her. "The kings have influence in this territory. We can petition the territorial court for recognition of your deed, and until that's resolved, you and Samuel stay here where we can protect you." The intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "Why are you doing this, Bennett? Why risk yourself for us?" He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched her cheek with calloused fingers. "Because in these few weeks, you and that boy have become more important to me than I thought possible." The confession hung between them, honest and vulnerable. Abigail felt her heart racing, confused by the emotions his words stirred. It was too soon, too complicated. She was still grieving Thomas. "I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give," Bennett said, reading her thoughts. "Just trust me enough to stay and let me help." After a long moment, Abigail nodded. "We'll stay, but I want to fight for what's mine. I owe Thomas that much." The next day, Bennett rode to the territorial capital with Mr. King to consult with a lawyer. They returned with both good and troubling news. Abigail's claim to the homestead was legally sound, but the Blackwater Company had already filed paperwork claiming the land was abandoned. "It'll come to a hearing before the land commissioner," Mr. King explained. "But we've got witnesses who can testify to what really happened." The weeks leading up to the hearing were tense. Abigail prepared her testimony with the lawyer's help, reliving the painful memories of Thomas's murder. Bennett remained a constant presence, dividing his time between ranch work and helping with Samuel, who was now sitting up on his own and babbling happily. One evening, as they sat together watching Samuel play with wooden blocks Bennett had carved, Abigail found herself studying the cowboy's profile in the lamplight. The strength in his jaw, the laugh lines at the corners of his eyes, the gentleness with which he guided Samuel's small hands, all of it stirred feelings she'd been trying to ignore. "What is it?" Bennett asked, catching her gaze. "I'm just thinking how different you are from what I expected when you first appeared in my doorway," she admitted. He smiled. "And what did you expect? A rough cowhand, I suppose. Not someone who carves toys and knows lullabies and argues land law with lawyers." Bennett chuckled. "My pa was a lawyer before he decided city life didn't suit him. Moved us to Texas when I was 10. He made sure I could read Shakespeare and rope a steer with equal skill." "He sounds wonderful," Abigail said. "He was." A shadow crossed Bennett's face. "Lost him and Ma both to influenza 6 years back. That's when I came north looking for something new." Abigail reached out impulsively and took his hand. "I'm sorry." His fingers closed around hers. "We've both known loss, maybe that's why." He trailed off, but his eyes finished the thought. The moment stretched between them, weighted with unspoken possibility. Samuel broke the spell by toppling his block tower and giggling at the crash. Bennett reluctantly released her hand to help the baby rebuild. The day of the hearing dawned clear and cold. Abigail wore her best dress, one Mrs. King had altered to fit her properly and carried Samuel in her arms as they entered the courthouse in Helena. Bennett and Mr. King flanked her protectively. The representatives from the Blackwater Company were already seated, 3 men in expensive suits with cold, calculating expressions. One of them, a hawk-faced man with steel-gray hair, looked at Abigail with recognition and undisguised malice. "That's him," she whispered to Bennett. "The one who shot Thomas." Bennett's hand went instinctively to where his gun would normally be, but weapons weren't allowed in the courtroom. Instead, he placed a steadying hand on Abigail's back. "He can't hurt you here," he assured her. "Just tell the truth." The hearing was grueling. The Blackwater lawyers painted Thomas as a squatter with no legal claim, despite the deed Abigail presented. They claimed she had abandoned the property willingly, and that Thomas had drawn a gun first during their peaceful negotiation. When it was Abigail's turn to testify, she handed Samuel to Mrs. King and took the stand with shaking legs but a steel spine. She recounted that terrible day in detail, how the men had arrived unannounced, demanded they vacate immediately. And when Thomas produced their deed, the hawk-faced man had drawn his pistol and shot him without provocation. "I ran because I feared for my child's life," she concluded, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "But that land is rightfully ours. My husband died defending our home, and I won't dishonor his memory by giving up what he believed in." The Blackwater men shifted uncomfortably as several townspeople who had known Thomas nodded in support. The land commissioner, a stern-faced man with kind eyes, questioned both sides thoroughly before announcing he would deliver his decision the following morning. That night, back at the hotel where the Kings had insisted on putting them up, Abigail paced the small room while Samuel slept soundly in a makeshift crib. "What if we lose?" she asked Bennett, who sat watching her from a chair by the window. "What if they get away with murder and theft?" "Then we appeal," he answered simply. "We keep fighting." She stopped pacing to look at him. "We," Bennett stood and crossed to her. "Yes, we. As long as you want me by your side, that's where I'll be." The certainty in his voice broke through the last of her resistance. Abigail stepped forward into his embrace, allowing herself to draw strength from his solid presence. "I'm afraid," she confessed against his chest. Bennett's arms tightened around her. "Fear's natural, courage is moving forward anyway." She looked up at him, suddenly aware of how close they were, of the warmth of his hands at her waist, of the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. "Bennett," she whispered, not quite sure what she wanted to say. He lowered his head slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. But Abigail found herself rising on her toes to meet him halfway, their lips touching in a kiss that started gentle but quickly deepened with months of unacknowledged longing. When they finally parted, both breathless, Bennett rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since I found you in that cabin," he admitted. "I wouldn't have let you then," she said with a small smile. "I know, you needed time." His thumb traced the curve of her cheek. "I'd have waited years if necessary." The sincerity in his voice made her heart swell. "I still miss Thomas," she said honestly. "I think a part of me always will." "As it should be," Bennett nodded. "Loving again doesn't dishonor what you had with him. It honors the capacity for love he knew you possessed." The wisdom of his words washed over her like a balm. For the first time since Thomas's death, Abigail felt the weight of guilt lifting from her heart. Morning brought nervous anticipation as they returned to the courthouse. The land commissioner entered with a solemn expression that gave nothing away. "Having reviewed all testimony and documentation," he began formally, "I find in favor of Mrs. Abigail Davis. The homestead legally belongs to her and her son as rightful heirs to Thomas Davis." Relief flooded through Abigail, so intense she might have collapsed if not for Bennett's steadying arm around her waist. "Furthermore," the commissioner continued, "I am referring the matter of Thomas Davis's death to the federal marshal for criminal investigation." The Blackwater representatives erupted in protests, but the commissioner silenced them with a raised hand. "Justice must be seen to be done, gentlemen. This hearing is concluded." Outside the courthouse, in the crisp Montana air, Abigail found herself surrounded by well-wishers. Samuel, sensing the excitement, laughed and reached for Bennett, who took him with practiced ease. "What will you do now?" Mrs. King asked when the crowd had dispersed. Abigail looked at Bennett, who was tossing Samuel gently in the air to the baby's delight. "I don't know," she admitted. "The homestead is ours, but—" She couldn't imagine returning to the place where Thomas had died. Yet it had been their dream, the land they had planned to pass down to Samuel. "Take your time deciding," Mr. King said kindly. Your place at Circle K remains open as long as you need it." That evening, after returning to the ranch, Bennett took Abigail for a walk while Mrs. King watched Samuel. He led her to a hill overlooking the valley where the sunset painted the landscape in gold and crimson. "I have something to ask you," Bennett said, his usual confidence replaced by nervous energy. Abigail felt her pulse quicken. "Yes," he took both her hands in his. "These past months, watching you fight for what's right, seeing your strength and tenderness with Samuel. I've fallen in love with you, Abigail Davis." Joy and apprehension mingled in her chest. "Bennett, I know it's soon," he hurried on. "And I know your heart still holds Thomas dear. I'm not asking you to forget him, but I want to build a future with you and Samuel if you'll have me." Tears pricked at Abigail's eyes, but they were different from the tears of grief she'd grown accustomed to. "What kind of future do you imagine?" Bennett's eyes were earnest as they held hers. "I've been saving for my own spread. With the money from your homestead, which should be sold, not because of the memories, but because it's too small for what I have in mind, we could buy that parcel east of the Circle K. It's good land, with water rights and enough acreage to build something lasting. Something for Samuel to inherit someday," Abigail said softly, understanding his vision, "for Samuel and maybe." Bennett swallowed hard, "Maybe for brothers or sisters too in time." The thought sent a flutter through Abigail's stomach. A family, a future. Things she'd thought lost forever when Thomas fell. "I don't need an answer today," Bennett assured her. "Just promise you'll consider it." Abigail looked out over the valley, then back to the man before her, this unexpected gift the universe had placed in her path during her darkest hour. The man who had first offered comfort with the simple words, "We'll rock him together." "I don't need time," she said, squeezing his hands. "My answer is yes." Bennett's face broke into a smile of such joy it took her breath away. He swept her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in an embrace that felt like coming home. "I love you, Abigail Davis," he whispered against her hair. "And I love you, Bennett Irwin," she replied, the words both a revelation and a declaration. They were married 2 months later in the Circle K's front parlor, with Samuel, now crawling enthusiastically, serving as honorary ring-bearer in Mrs. King's arms. The territorial marshal had arrested the Blackwater men responsible for Thomas's death, bringing a measure of justice that helped Abigail close that painful chapter. With the proceeds from selling the homestead, they purchased the land Bennett had spoken of and began building a house larger than necessary for their small family, but designed with the future in mind. Bennett insisted on a wide front porch where they could watch sunsets together and a special room for Samuel filled with light. On a warm evening one year after Bennett had first found her in that abandoned cabin, Abigail sat in a rocking chair on their new porch, Samuel asleep against her shoulder. Bennett joined her, settling into the matching rocker he'd built himself. "Happy?" he asked, reaching over to take her free hand. Abigail looked at their intertwined fingers, the gold bands catching the last rays of sunlight. "More than I ever thought possible again." Bennett leaned over to kiss her softly, "And this is just the beginning." As if to underscore his words, Abigail guided his hand to rest on her stomach, still flat but now harboring their newest secret. Bennett's eyes widened in understanding before filling with tears of joy. "Really?" he whispered. Abigail nodded, her own eyes shining. "Really. Come spring, Samuel will have a little brother or sister to look after." Bennett slid from his chair to kneel before her, pressing a reverent kiss to her stomach before looking up with a face full of wonder. "I promise you both, I'll be the best father and husband I can be every day of our lives." "I know you will," Abigail said, running her fingers through his hair. "You already are." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across their land, Abigail reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From devastating loss to unexpected love, from a desperate woman crying beside her baby's cradle to a family with a future full of promise. "What are you thinking about?" Bennett asked, returning to his chair but keeping hold of her hand. Abigail smiled, watching Samuel's peaceful, sleeping face. "I'm thinking about that night in the cabin, how I thought it was the end of everything, but it was really just the beginning." Bennett nodded, understanding as he always did. Life has a way of bringing us what we need, even when we think all hope is lost. Samuel stirred slightly, and together, instinctively, they rocked in unison, the gentle rhythm soothing their son back to deeper sleep together, as they would face everything life brought their way in the years to come.